The envelope sat on our kitchen table for 3 days before I finally opened it. My husband Marcus had left it there Tuesday morning with a note that read, "We need to talk about this tonight." But Tuesday night he'd worked late. Wednesday he'd claimed exhaustion. Thursday morning I'd woken early, made coffee, and decided I was done waiting for him to orchestrate whatever conversation he thought we needed. Inside the envelope were divorce papers. Professionally prepared, neatly organized, with colored tabs marking where signatures were required. I scanned through them quickly, my legal training kicking in, despite the emotional punch of seeing our 15-year marriage reduced to contractual terms and asset divisions. The settlement terms were surprisingly generous. I'd receive the house outright, valued at approximately $900,000, with no remaining mortgage. I'd receive 65% of our joint investment accounts, totaling roughly $400,000. I'd receive spousal support of $6,000 monthly for 7 years. Marcus would retain his business, his retirement accounts, and the vacation property in Vermont. The division heavily favored me, which immediately made me suspicious. Marcus was many things, but financially reckless wasn't one of them. He wouldn't propose terms this generous without reason, and that reason probably wasn't simple guilt or desire to be fair. I was still reviewing the documents when Marcus emerged from our bedroom, clearly surprised to find me awake and at the kitchen table. "You opened it," Marcus said, stating the obvious as he poured himself coffee. "When were you planning to actually discuss this?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral despite my racing heart. "I thought we'd talk last night, but I had that client emergency." "You've had a client emergency every night this week," I interrupted, almost like you've been avoiding this conversation. Marcus had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I wanted to give you time to process before we discuss details." "Details," I repeated flatly. "Is that what we're calling the end of our marriage?" "Details?" He sat down across from me, assuming the calm, reasonable expression he used when negotiating business deals. I'd seen this face countless times over 15 years. The slight frown of concern, the careful eye contact, the measured tone designed to project sincerity and control. "Victoria, our marriage hasn't been working for a long time," Marcus began, his voice taking on that rehearsed quality that suggested he'd practiced this speech. "We've grown into different people with different priorities. I think we both know continuing like this isn't healthy for either of us." I said nothing, just watched him build his argument like he was presenting a business case. "I've tried to be fair with the settlement terms," Marcus continued. "You'll be financially secure, you'll have the house, and you'll have time to figure out what you want to do next professionally. I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to give us both a chance at happiness." "How considerate," I said, my tone making the words anything but complimentary. "And I suppose the timing of this has nothing to do with the 28-year-old marketing associate at your firm. What's her name again? Brianna?" Marcus's carefully controlled expression cracked slightly. How did I know? I'm a corporate attorney, Marcus. I notice things. The changed passwords on your phone, the unexplained evening meetings, the way you smile at text messages you won't show me. I've known for 3 months. He recovered quickly, shifting tactics. "If you've known, then you understand why this is the right choice. We're not happy, Victoria. We haven't been happy for years. Continuing this marriage is just prolonging the inevitable." "And Brianna makes you happy?" I asked. Marcus had the audacity to look wounded. "This isn't about her. This is about us, about recognizing that we've reached the end of what we can be to each other." I looked down at the divorce papers, at the generous terms that suddenly made perfect sense. Marcus was feeling guilty about the affair, about abandoning our marriage for someone younger. His guilt had translated into financial generosity, terms designed to assuage his conscience while giving him freedom to pursue his new relationship. "I need to explain something about the settlement," Marcus said, clearly moving into the negotiation portion of his prepared speech. "These terms are based on current asset valuations, but obviously we'll need to discuss some adjustments." I picked up the pen that had been lying next to the papers and clicked it open. "Before you continue," I said calmly, "I just want you to know I'm signing these." Marcus stopped mid-sentence, his mouth actually hanging open for a moment. "What?" Now, don't you want to have your attorney review them first? Discuss the terms? Talk about... I am an attorney, I reminded him, flipping to the first signature page. And I've reviewed the terms. They're acceptable. I initialed the first tab, then the second, working through the document with methodical efficiency. Marcus looked increasingly alarmed as I progressed through the pages. Victoria, wait. You should really take time to think about this, to understand what you're agreeing to. I understand perfectly, I said, continuing to sign. You're giving me the house, 65% of investments, 7 years of substantial spousal support. It's quite generous, really. Why would I need time to reconsider? Because there are things we need to discuss. Marcus's voice had risen, his careful control slipping. The house has significant deferred maintenance that will be expensive. The investment accounts include some volatile holdings that might not perform well. The spousal support is contingent on certain conditions. What conditions? I asked, my pen pausing over the next signature line. They're not in the document. Marcus ran his hand through his hair in a gesture I recognized as frustration. That's what I wanted to discuss tonight. There are some understandings we need to reach, some additional agreements. If they're not in the document, they're not part of the agreement, I said, returning to signing. What's written here is what I'm accepting. Nothing more, nothing less. I could see Marcus calculating, trying to figure out how to stop what was happening. He'd clearly expected this to be a lengthy negotiation, a process he could control and shape to his advantage. Instead, I was accepting his terms as written before he could add verbal conditions or pressure me into concessions. You're not even going to ask about the business? Marcus tried. About how the valuation was calculated or what my actual income is. The document lists your business valuation at $2.3 million, I replied. If that's inaccurate, you should have provided correct figures before presenting these papers. But since you didn't, I'm accepting the terms as written. I signed the final page with a flourish and slid the complete document across the table. There, all signed. I assume you'll file these with the court? Marcus stared at the papers like they might burst into flames. This is insane. You're not even upset. You're not crying or arguing or trying to change my mind. Why would I do any of that? I asked reasonably. You've made your decision. You've proposed terms, I've accepted them. What's left to argue about? But the house needs at least $200,000 in repairs, Marcus blurted. The roof, the foundation, the electrical system, it's all going to need major work. I was going to explain that you'd probably want to sell it rather than deal with those costs. If you'd wanted to negotiate the house differently, you should have included that in the written terms, I said, but you didn't. You offered me the house outright, and I've accepted. I stood up, ready to end this conversation and start processing what had just happened. My marriage was over, formalized by signatures on legal documents that were now binding, regardless of what additional conditions Marcus had imagined negotiating. I'm going to stay with my sister for a few weeks, I said. While we're both adjusting to this new situation, I'll arrange to collect more of my belongings once you've filed the papers and we have a formal timeline. Marcus was still staring at the signed documents, clearly trying to figure out how this had gotten away from him so completely. Victoria, we need to talk about this properly. You're not understanding. I understand perfectly, I interrupted. You wanted a divorce, you drafted terms, I signed them. Now you're discovering that the generous settlement you proposed to assuage your guilt about sleeping with Brianna is actually going to be expensive. That's your problem to solve, not mine. I grabbed my phone and keys, leaving Marcus sitting at the kitchen table with the signed divorce papers that had suddenly become much more costly than he'd intended. The door closed behind me with satisfying finality. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in my attorney's office, not because I needed legal advice about the divorce, but because Marcus's attorney had been calling repeatedly, asking for meetings to discuss revisions to our agreement. Your husband wants to renegotiate the settlement, my attorney Helena Anderson said, reviewing the messages from Marcus's lawyer. They're claiming the terms were presented prematurely, that important discussions hadn't occurred, that you signed without proper consideration. I had 3 days to consider, I replied. And I'm an attorney myself. I reviewed the terms carefully before signing. Helena smiled slightly. That's exactly what I told them. Mr. Hayes drafted generous terms, you accepted them, and now he's experiencing buyer's remorse. But that's not grounds for revision. What exactly does Marcus want changed? I asked. Helena consulted her notes. He wants to reduce the spousal support to $4,000 monthly for 5 years instead of $6,000 for 7 years. He wants to split the investment accounts 50-50 instead of 65-35. And he wants you to take on half the cost of necessary repairs to the house. All things he should have considered before drafting the original terms, I observed. Exactly, Helena agreed. His attorney admits they're in a difficult position. Your husband drafted favorable terms out of guilt about his affair, presented them to you, and you signed before he could add the verbal conditions he'd apparently planned to negotiate. Now he's stuck with an agreement that's more generous than he intended. Can he force renegotiation? They asked. Helena shook her head. Not unless you agree to it. And I strongly advise against agreeing. These terms are legal, properly executed, and favorable to you. There's no reason to give any of that up. Over the next month, Marcus made several attempts to convince me to modify our agreement. His attorney sent formal requests for revised terms. Marcus called me directly, alternating between pleading and accusation. He even tried approaching mutual friends to intercede on his behalf. I declined every attempt at modification. The terms were set, signed, and filed with the court. Marcus had proposed them, I'd accepted them, and now they were binding. You're being vindictive, Marcus accused during one particularly heated phone call. You're punishing me for ending the marriage by holding me to terms I didn't fully intend. I'm not punishing you, I replied calmly. I'm simply holding you accountable for terms you drafted and presented. If those terms don't reflect your actual intentions, that's unfortunate, but it's not my responsibility to help you revise them. I was trying to be fair, Marcus protested. I was trying to make this as painless as possible, and you took advantage of that generosity. If being fair was your goal, you succeeded, I said. I received a fair settlement. The fact that you're now realizing fair settlements are expensive doesn't change that they're fair. Marcus hung up on me. We didn't speak again until the divorce was finalized, 3 months later. The divorce hearing was brief and procedural. The judge reviewed our signed agreement, confirmed both parties had legal representation and understood the terms, and issued the final decree dissolving our marriage. Marcus looked furious throughout the proceedings, clearly still bitter about being held to terms he'd drafted hastily. I felt nothing really. No satisfaction in his anger, no triumph in securing favorable terms. Just a calm sense of closure and readiness to move forward. After the hearing, Marcus's attorney approached Helena one final time. My client wants you to know he thinks your client acted unethically by signing those papers before he could explain the full context of the terms. Helena's response was ice-cold professional courtesy. Your client drafted terms and presented them for signature. My client reviewed and signed them. There's nothing unethical about accepting an offer that was made freely. If your client wanted discussion before signatures, he should have communicated that clearly, rather than assuming my client would follow some imagined script for how divorce negotiations should proceed. The attorney had no response to that. Over the following months, I discovered exactly why Marcus had been so desperate to revise the settlement terms. The house did need significant repairs. About $200,000 worth of work on the roof, foundation, and electrical systems, exactly as Marcus had tried to warn me. But the work was necessary for any owner, and Marcus had known about these issues while drafting terms that gave me the house without mention of required repairs. The investment accounts included several highly speculative holdings that lost value shortly after our divorce finalized. If I'd agreed to an even 50-50 split, I'd have lost more in the declining value. But because I'd received 65% from our original agreement, I'd taken proportionally more from stable holdings before the speculative ones crashed. Marcus's business, which he'd valued at $2.3 million in the divorce papers, was actually worth closer to $3.8 million based on a valuation I had done by a forensic accountant after the divorce finalized. He'd deliberately understated the value, probably planning to correct it during negotiations that I'd bypassed by signing immediately. Your husband thought he was being clever, Helena told me when I showed her the forensic accountant's report. He drafted generous terms to appear magnanimous while actually including several traps: problem assets, understated business value, a house with expensive, deferred maintenance. He assumed you'd negotiate, and during negotiations, he'd steer you toward the problematic assets while retaining the valuable ones. But I signed before he could execute that strategy, I said, understanding dawning. Exactly. By accepting the written terms immediately, you got the generous support payments, the favorable investment split before you knew which holdings were problematic, and the house which, despite needed repairs, is valuable property in an appreciating market. Meanwhile, he stuck with the deliberately understated business valuation and the knowledge that he undervalued his primary asset to make other assets look more attractive. I felt a cold satisfaction understanding how completely my decision to sign immediately had disrupted Marcus's planned manipulation. He'd tried to look generous while actually setting traps, and his strategy had backfired when I'd accepted his nominal generosity before he could spring those traps. 6 months after the divorce, I'd completed the necessary repairs on the house using funds from my settlement. The property had appreciated to approximately $1.1 million, a $200,000 increase that more than covered the repair costs. The remaining investment accounts, after selling off the declining speculative holdings, were stable and generating steady returns. The spousal support payments arrived monthly, providing comfortable income while I considered my next career move. I'd taken a leave of absence from my legal practice during the divorce, and now I was deciding whether to return to corporate law or pursue something different. Meanwhile, I heard through mutual friends that Marcus's life hadn't gone as smoothly as he'd anticipated. His relationship with Brianna had ended badly, within months of our divorce finalizing. Apparently, she'd expected him to be wealthier than he actually was after the settlement, and she'd been disappointed to discover he was making substantial monthly support payments while dealing with business pressures. She thought Marcus was this successful, wealthy businessman, our mutual friend Caroline told me over coffee. Then she realized he'd given away a house and significant assets in the divorce, was paying you substantial monthly support, and was stressed about keeping his business profitable. The exciting affair became a burdensome reality pretty quickly. I'm not surprised, I said honestly. Affairs are exciting because they're fantasy. Reality is much less glamorous. Marcus is also apparently bitter about the divorce settlement, Caroline continued. He's been telling people you manipulated him, that you took advantage of his good faith attempt to be fair. He drafted the terms, I said simply. I accepted them. There's no manipulation in accepting what someone offers freely. But Marcus's narrative that I'd somehow tricked him or taken advantage began circulating among our former mutual friends. Some people sided with him, viewing me as calculating and cold for accepting favorable terms without negotiating them down. Others recognized that Marcus had created his own problems by drafting terms he hadn't fully considered. The social fallout was interesting if ultimately irrelevant to my actual life. A few friendships ended, people choosing sides in a divorce that wasn't really about sides. Other friendships deepened as people showed their true character through how they handled the situation. A year after the divorce, I'd settled into a new routine that felt authentically mine rather than shaped around someone else's needs and schedule. I'd returned to legal practice part-time, focusing on cases that interested me, rather than maximizing billable hours. I'd started teaching an evening course on contract law at the local university, enjoying the intellectual stimulation of working with students. I'd traveled to places Marcus had never wanted to visit, pursuing interests I'd set aside during marriage to accommodate his preferences. The house had become entirely my space, decorated in a style Marcus had called too eclectic, but that I found warm and engaging. I'd converted his home office into a library, filled with books I actually wanted to read, rather than the business texts Marcus had displayed as professional props. I'd also started dating casually, testing the waters after 15 years of marriage. The first few dates were awkward. I'd been with Marcus since my 20s and had no idea how to navigate modern dating culture. But gradually I found my footing, meeting interesting people and learning what I actually wanted from partnership, rather than just accepting whatever relationship presented itself. One relationship became semi-serious, a man named Oliver who was a professor at the university where I taught. We dated for 6 months, developing genuine connection and enjoying each other's company. But ultimately, we wanted different things from the relationship's trajectory, and we ended things amicably. "You're still figuring out who you are post-divorce," Oliver observed during our breakup conversation. "That's healthy and necessary, but it means you're not really available for committed partnership right now. You need more time being independently yourself." He was absolutely right. I wasn't ready for serious commitment because I was still enjoying the discovery of who I was, without Marcus's influence, expectations, and subtle control shaping my choices. 18 months after the divorce, I ran into Marcus at a professional networking event we both attended. He looked older and more worn than I remembered, the confident businessman replaced by someone carrying visible stress. "Hello, Marcus," I said when our paths crossed near the refreshment table. "How are you?" "Fine," he replied tersely. "You look well. I heard you're teaching now, in addition to your practice." "Part-time," I confirmed. "I'm enjoying the variety of focusing on cases I choose while working with law students." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Must be nice to have that financial flexibility. Some of us have to work full-time to cover our expenses." The bitterness was obvious, and I understood its source. Marcus was struggling financially, working long hours to maintain his business profitability while making substantial monthly support payments to me. Meanwhile, I'd used the settlement to create financial flexibility that allowed me to work less while pursuing interests he couldn't afford. "You drafted the terms," I reminded him gently. "I simply accepted what you offered." "I offered those terms in good faith," Marcus countered, "expecting we'd negotiate like reasonable people. You took advantage of that good faith by signing before I could explain what I'd actually intended." "If you'd intended different terms, you should have written different terms," I replied. "But you chose to draft generous terms, presumably to assuage guilt about your affair with Brianna. I accepted those generous terms as written. That's not taking advantage, that's simply accepting an offer." A woman approached, young, attractive, clearly someone Marcus had brought as his date to the networking event. She gave me an assessing look, probably trying to figure out who I was and why Marcus seemed tense talking to me. "This is Fiona," Marcus introduced his companion. "Fiona, this is my ex-wife Victoria." Fiona's expression shifted to poorly concealed hostility. "Oh, you're the one Marcus told me about. The one who took advantage of him during the divorce." "I accepted the settlement he proposed," I corrected mildly. "That's not taking advantage, that's just accepting an offer." "You knew he expected to negotiate," Fiona insisted, apparently viewing herself as Marcus's advocate. "You signed before he could explain what the terms actually meant, and now he's paying the price for your manipulation." I could have pointed out that Marcus's manipulation, undervaluing his business, including problem assets, failing to mention the house needed expensive repairs, had been the actual manipulation in our divorce. But engaging with Fiona's hostile assumptions seemed pointless. "I wish you both well," I said instead, preparing to leave this uncomfortable conversation. "Marcus, it was good to see you looking well. Fiona, nice to meet you." As I walked away, I heard Fiona saying something to Marcus about how I'd clearly been the problem in our marriage. With that, how she could tell I was cold and calculating. I felt a moment of dark amusement. Marcus had apparently found another woman who believed his version of events without question. 2 years after the divorce, I'd used the financial stability from my settlement to make a career change I'd been considering for years. I left my corporate law practice entirely and opened a small firm focused on representing women in divorce proceedings. My own experience had taught me how divorce could be financially devastating when one party controlled information and manipulated terms. I wanted to help women navigate those situations with advocates who understood the strategies unfavorable spouses employed. The practice was immediately busy. Referrals came from other attorneys, from former clients, from women who'd heard about my own divorce story, and wanted representation from someone who'd successfully navigated a manipulative settlement process. I hired 2 associate attorneys and a paralegal within the first year, building a practice that combined financial acumen with aggressive advocacy for clients who'd been underestimated by their spouses. One case particularly resonated with my own experience. A client named Sophie was divorcing a wealthy businessman who'd presented her with settlement papers claiming to be fair, while actually including numerous traps and undervalued assets. "He wants me to sign quickly," Sophie told me during our initial consultation. "He says dragging out negotiations will just create unnecessary legal fees and stress. But something feels wrong about how eager he is for me to accept these terms without review." I spent a week reviewing Sophie's proposed settlement, finding exactly what I'd expected: understated business valuations, problematic asset allocations, missing disclosures about debts and liabilities. Her husband had crafted terms that looked generous on the surface, but were actually designed to leave Sophie with minimal real value while he retained the lucrative assets. "Do not sign this," I told Sophie firmly. "These terms are designed to look fair while actually being quite unfavorable to you. We need to counter with demands for full financial disclosure and proper valuations." Over the following months, I helped Sophie negotiate a settlement that gave her actual fairness rather than the appearance of fairness her husband had proposed. The process was contentious and expensive, but Sophie walked away with assets worth 3 times what her husband's original proposal had offered. "Thank you," Sophie said after her divorce finalized. "If I'd signed what he proposed, I'd have been financially devastated. Instead, I have real security to rebuild my life." Cases like Sophie's validated my decision to leave corporate law and focus on divorce representation. I was using my own experience with Marcus's manipulative settlement to help other women avoid similar traps, or, like I had, to recognize and accept genuinely favorable terms when they were offered. 3 years after my divorce, the spousal support payments ended as specified in our original agreement. 7 years of monthly payments had concluded, totaling $504,000 as agreed. I received a final email from Marcus's attorney confirming all financial obligations were complete and no further payments were owed. That was it. My financial connection to Marcus was severed. I heard through former mutual friends that Marcus had celebrated the end of support payments, apparently viewing them as a burden he'd finally escaped. His business had apparently stabilized and grown, and he'd remarried. Not Fiona, but someone new he'd met through work. I felt nothing, hearing about his remarriage, except a mild noting that he'd moved forward with his life. I'd long since moved past our marriage and had no emotional investment in Marcus's current circumstances. 4 years after signing those divorce papers, before Marcus could finish explaining his intentions, I sat in my office reviewing the success of my divorce law practice. The firm had grown to 7 employees, was generating substantial revenue, and had developed a reputation as aggressive advocates for women navigating high-asset divorces. I'd also purchased an investment property, a small commercial building that I renovated and leased to local businesses. The property generated passive income while appreciating in value, building wealth beyond what I'd received in my divorce settlement. My personal life had evolved as well. I'd been in a serious relationship for over a year with a man named William, a fellow attorney who specialized in family law. We'd met at a legal conference, discovered shared values and compatible personalities, and had been building a partnership based on mutual respect, rather than one person subordinating their needs to the other. "I appreciate that you're financially independent," William told me during one conversation about our future. "Too many relationships have power imbalances created by financial inequality. The fact that we're both successful and secure means we're choosing each other for the right reasons, compatibility and care, rather than need or convenience." He was right. My financial independence from the divorce settlement and my successful practice meant I was dating William because I genuinely wanted to be with him, not because I needed financial support or partnership. That made our relationship healthier and more authentic. 5 years after the divorce, I received an unexpected message from Marcus. It was brief and formal. Congratulations on the success of my law practice, along with an acknowledgement that he'd heard I was in a serious relationship. I responded politely, thanking him for the well wishes, and expressing hope that his own remarriage was bringing him happiness. There was no animosity in the exchange, no lingering resentment or unfinished emotional business. We were simply two people who'd once been married, acknowledging each other's continued existence from a significant distance. "Do you ever regret how you handled the divorce?" William asked me one evening when we were discussing our respective past relationships. Specifically, signing those papers before Marcus could finish explaining his conditions. I considered the question honestly. I regret that the marriage ended, that Marcus's affair made divorce necessary. But I don't regret signing the papers immediately, or refusing to help him revise terms he'd drafted hastily. I paused before continuing. If I'd let him finish talking that day, he would have explained all the problems with the assets he was offering. The house, repairs, the troubled investments, his understated business valuation. He would have steered me toward accepting less favorable terms while appearing to negotiate in good faith. Instead, by signing immediately, you accepted the nominal terms before he could execute his manipulation strategy, William observed. Exactly. And that decision changed everything. It gave me financial security that funded my career change, my business, my independence. If I'd negotiated in good faith with someone who was negotiating in bad faith, I'd be in a much different situation now. "So you're not sorry he struggled financially as a result?" William pressed. "I'm not glad anyone struggles," I replied carefully. "But I'm not sorry that I protected my own interests rather than making his transition to a new relationship easier. He made choices, to have an affair, to draft manipulative settlement terms, to undervalue assets while overemphasizing problems. I simply made the choice to accept what he'd written before he could revise it." William nodded thoughtfully. "That's what I admire about you. You don't apologize for protecting yourself, but you also don't celebrate someone else's difficulties. You just move forward with clarity about your own priorities and boundaries." 6 years after signing those divorce papers, I was invited to speak at a legal conference about strategic approaches to high-asset divorce representation. I'd become somewhat known in family law circles for my successful advocacy and my own divorce story that demonstrated the importance of accepting favorable terms decisively. Standing before a room of 200 attorneys, I told the story of that morning in my kitchen when I'd signed divorce papers before Marcus could finish his prepared explanation of terms. My ex-husband had drafted settlement terms that appeared generous, while actually including numerous traps and manipulations, I explained to the audience. He'd undervalued his business, included troubled investments, and failed to mention that the house needed expensive repairs. He'd done all this while planning to appear magnanimous during negotiations, where he'd steer me away from valuable assets and toward problematic ones. I described what happened next, my decision to sign immediately, Marcus's panic, his attempts to revise terms that were now binding. The decision to sign before he finished talking changed everything, I told the audience. It protected me from a negotiation strategy designed to appear fair while actually being quite manipulative. It locked in terms he couldn't revise once he realized their actual cost, and it gave me financial security that funded a complete career transformation. I paused before continuing. But more importantly, it taught me that protecting your client's interests sometimes means acting decisively rather than cautiously. It means recognizing when an offer is actually favorable, despite attempts to make it seem problematic. It means understanding that good faith negotiation sometimes means accepting good terms before the other party can revise them. The response was enthusiastic. After my presentation, dozens of attorneys approached to discuss strategy, to share their own experiences with manipulative opposing counsel, to ask about how I'd built my practice around these principles. "My client's husband is pushing her to sign settlement papers quickly," one attorney told me. "He claims he's being generous, but pushing for immediate signatures. How do I know if it's genuinely favorable or a trap?" "Have a forensic accountant review all asset valuations," I replied. Have a tax attorney examine the consequences of different asset distributions. Take time to understand what you're actually accepting. But once you understand it, don't hesitate to accept favorable terms before they can be revised. That advice, thorough review followed by decisive acceptance, became the foundation of my practice's approach to high-asset divorces. We reviewed everything carefully, but once we determined terms were actually favorable, we accepted them immediately, rather than negotiating away advantages through false assumptions about what fair negotiation required. 7 years after the divorce, William and I got married in a small ceremony attended by close friends and family. It was my second marriage and his second as well. Approached with mature understanding of what partnership required, rather than romantic illusions that had characterized our first marriages. Our relationship was built on financial independence, mutual respect, authentic communication, and shared values that made us genuinely compatible, rather than just temporarily compatible. We maintained separate finances while sharing household expenses proportionally, preserving the independence that made our partnership healthy. During our honeymoon, I received a message from Marcus. It was longer than his previous communication, reflecting on our divorce and acknowledging that his attempts to manipulate the settlement had been wrong. I thought I was being clever, Marcus wrote, drafting terms that looked generous while actually being favorable to me once we negotiated. But you were smarter and more decisive than I anticipated. You accepted my nominal generosity before I could revise it, and you were right to do so. He continued, I've spent 7 years resenting how the divorce turned out, blaming you for taking advantage of my good faith. But I've been in therapy working through my second marriage, and I've realized I was never acting in good faith. I was acting manipulatively, and you simply didn't fall for my manipulation. That's not your fault, that's mine. The message concluded with something resembling genuine apology. I'm sorry for trying to manipulate you during our divorce. I'm sorry for having an affair and handling our marriage's end so poorly, and I'm genuinely glad you've built a successful life and found happiness. You deserved better than how I treated you, and I'm glad you demanded better by refusing to negotiate away advantages I'd inadvertently offered you. I showed the message to William, asking his perspective on whether Marcus's apology was genuine or another manipulation. It seems genuine, William assessed. He's acknowledging his own manipulation rather than blaming you for recognizing it. That suggests real growth rather than attempted further manipulation. Should I respond? I asked. William considered. That's your choice. But if you do, I'd suggest keeping it brief and focused on moving forward rather than rehashing the past. I sent a brief response thanking Marcus for his apology and expressing hope that his therapy was helping him build healthier relationships. I didn't forgive him explicitly or suggest any renewed connection, just acknowledged his message and wished him well. 8 years after signing those divorce papers before Marcus could finish talking, I stood in my office looking out at the city, reflecting on how completely my life had transformed from that morning in my kitchen. The decision to sign immediately had been instinctive rather than calculated, a gut feeling that letting Marcus finish his explanation would result in me accepting less favorable terms through pressure and manufactured guilt. That instinct had been correct, and the consequences of trusting it had shaped everything that followed. The financial security from the settlement had funded my career transition from corporate law to specialized divorce practice. My practice had grown successful by applying lessons from my own experience, thorough analysis of proposed terms, recognition of manipulation strategies, and decisive acceptance of genuinely favorable settlements. My personal life had evolved into authentic partnership with William, built on foundations of independence and mutual respect rather than financial need or subordination. I'd helped dozens of women navigate divorces where their spouses attempted similar manipulations to what Marcus had tried: understated business valuations, strategic inclusion of problem assets, pressure to accept terms quickly without thorough review. Some clients, like Sophie, we'd protected through aggressive negotiation and forensic accounting. Other clients I'd advised to accept favorable terms immediately, recognizing when opposing counsel had drafted generous settlements they'd later want to revise. Your divorce story is basically my practice's origin story, I told William one evening. The decision to sign before Marcus finished talking wasn't just personal vindication. It was a masterclass in recognizing and accepting favorable terms decisively before they can be revised. It's also a story about trusting your instincts, William observed. You sensed that letting Marcus finish would result in worse terms. You trusted that instinct despite social pressure to negotiate cooperatively. That trust in your own judgment was as important as the strategic advantage you gained. 9 years after the divorce, my firm had grown to include 12 attorneys and support staff, with a reputation as the most aggressive advocates for women in high-asset divorces in our region. We'd handled divorces involving business owners, physicians, corporate executives, and entrepreneurs, cases where opposing counsel often attempted the same strategies Marcus had tried with me. I'd also started teaching a course on divorce law strategy at the law school, sharing tactics I'd learned from my own experience and subsequent practice. The course was popular with students interested in family law, and several of my former students had joined my practice after graduation. One lecture each semester focused on my own divorce, analyzing it as a case study in recognizing manipulation and responding strategically. My ex-husband drafted settlement terms that appeared generous on the surface, I told students. But he'd included numerous problems and manipulations he planned to leverage during negotiation. By signing immediately, I accepted his nominal generosity before he could execute his actual strategy. I walked through the specifics: the understated business valuation, the troubled investments, the house with deferred maintenance, showing how each element was designed to look bad while actually being manageable or even advantageous. The lesson isn't just about my specific divorce, I concluded. It's about understanding that fair negotiation sometimes means accepting favorable terms decisively, rather than negotiating them away through false assumptions about cooperation or good faith. The students always had questions.